Now we've got to have more energy here tonight. Good evening. It's 6 o'clock. The day is over. We've worked and done all that we need to do. And tonight we find ourselves this evening in Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Washington, D.C. I'm pleased to welcome you as pastor of this wonderful congregation. I want to begin by thanking all of our staff and leaders who have opened up the doors and done all of the work that makes hospitality, your hospitality, possible this evening. Especially want to call the names of Lucille Knowles and Ruth Fullwood, Terry Johnson, Helen Harvin, Moya Harris, and all of our great team here. Now, you are in a place of great historical import here in the city. This is the longest continuously held piece of property by persons of African descent in the District of Columbia. This building has been here since 1885. The congregation has been in existence for 181 years. And many of the people that we read about and study about in the history of Washington, history of the United States, their paths connected here. Frederick Douglass, Ida Wells Barnett, W.E.B. Du Bois, many luminaries who fought for justice and freedom in this nation, but also fought for international justice and peace. And that is in our DNA as a people of faith. Here we continue to worship and to liberate and to serve in Washington, D.C. Right now we're focused on displacement of our neighbors as property values skyrocket, as developers begin to leverage more and more political power. We want to make sure that those who have been in the city can stay in the city. We don't want Washington, D.C. to become Manhattan, and that's one of the things that we're working on. We're also working on issues of education and healthcare, working with returning citizens. And so the work of our past is the work of our present and our future, and we welcome you here. But most especially this evening, we want to welcome our own Congresswoman, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton. Would you put your hands together and welcome her this evening?
Reverend Lamar, could I indicate this was the church's idea,
Right.
and it says everything about Metropolitan, who is so involved in our civic life and in our spiritual life, that at this moment, as we are preparing for our hearing on DC statehood, that, Reverend Lamar, you would invite me here at one of our oldest and certainly one of our most distinguished churches. So it is our honor to be here to discuss our city. It feels completely natural to be discussing our city at Metropolitan A.M.E.
Well, thank you, and we welcome you. I want to begin by asking you, Congresswoman, to tell us your Washington, D.C. story.
My Washington, D.C. story goes back to my great-grandfather, a runaway slave from Virginia who made his way to Washington in the 1850s. And I don't need to tell you, Reverend Lamar, that one of the first things African Americans did when they came to this church was to start a church. So my grandfather walked away from slavery and walked to Washington, D.C. Didn't get much further. Worked on the streets as they were building Washington, D.C. And perhaps the story that has been handed down to me in my family is about how Richard Holmes got to stay here. Apparently, he was working on the streets like so many other African Americans. The city was being built. They needed people to work the streets. But if you had a runaway slave and you could find him, this was territory to come to. This was the Old South. This is D.C. below the Mason-Dixon line. This is the District of Columbia where Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves just 9 months before the Civil War. So this is no free territory you're coming to. Richard Holmes was working the streets on a job here, helping to build our capital. And remember, all of your historic buildings were built with slave labor, sometimes free labor as well, but also slave labor. The man who owned Richard Holmes spotted him, came up behind him, and yelled his name, Richard. Apparently, Richard kept digging. The man who owned Richard went to the foreman and said, "That's my slave, I've come to fetch him." The white man, of course, who was the foreman, said, "That can't possibly be your Negro." He never even answered to that name. My only, obviously, is my great-grandfather. I never knew him. My own grandfather entered the D.C. Fire Department in 1903, so he knew him. What it says to me is that Richard Holmes contemplated the day when he would be found. He wasn't hiding. He couldn't afford to hide. And I can only think that he must have practiced not answering to his name. The story of Richard Holmes has taught me to be disciplined and to not call them what they are when the Republicans try to take away our home rule.
Now, your story also intersects the story of the battle, former, ongoing battle for civil rights. You had occasion to spend time with Medgar Evers. Could you share a little bit about that story? I was fascinated by that.
I just wish I could have spent more time with him. When I was in law school, I joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So that's on the summer, I think it was the summer of '63, I went south to Mississippi. I was met at the airport by Medgar Evers. Jackson, Mississippi, and the Delta to which I was going was the last frontier of the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement had penetrated most of the South, but Mississippi was a very different place. So different that Medgar Evers, the adult secretary of the NAACP, had to lead sit-ins, not students, in Mississippi. And he did and was arrested. So though I was a law student, they were so short on people with any legal expertise that Medgar Evers implored me to stay in Jackson. I said, I can't possibly. I promise some of you may know the name Bob Moses, that I would come to the Delta. And so I simply must go. Medgar Evers, after showing me all around Jackson the kinds of things they were doing in order to integrate that city, took me to the bus station for what must have been a 2-hour ride. I got to where I was staying, and I was taken to a sharecropper's house and told that when I awakened the next day, they would be gone picking whatever they picked. And they showed this city girl the tub where you could take a bath. That was a tin tub. And they showed me how to heat the water. I was sitting in that tin tub the next morning when there came a knock on the door. And this child, these were children in the civil rights movement there. They said, they need you up the street at their headquarters. because Medgar Evers has just been shot and killed. This was my introduction to the state of Mississippi.
Now, what got you as a law student at Yale, no less, interested in SNCC?
What got me as a law student interested in SNCC is growing up in the District of Columbia, going to segregated schools, living in a city which had segregation as much as in the South, though a more progressive city, with a very enlightened black population who taught its children not that segregation was wrong and there's something you ought to do about it, but made the children of segregation understand that it certainly wasn't them. As we found that we could not go in public places in this city, could not go to the movies and the restaurants, we were taught that understand there's nothing wrong with you, but there must be something wrong with people who would want to keep people like us out of the facilities available to everyone else. So if you grew up in Washington, when I grew up, the last thing you had was any sense of inferiority.
You did not have a sense of inferiority?
We owe that not only to our parents, we owe that to places like Dunbar High School, which for years was the only college preparatory high school for Negro students, who sent its students to the best colleges in the United States. You know, we owe this to how the African American community gathered around its young and chased away before they ever understood it any sense of inferiority. You have to understand how much better off we were than our brothers and sisters in Virginia, for example, who would have found it hard to escape the notion of inferiority given the lives they lived.
So many people who grew up as you grew up chose a lot of fields of endeavor for change, to make the world different, more just, and you chose politics. Why did you choose politics?
No, I did not choose politics. I chose the study of the law.
You chose the study of the law.
It was inconceivable to me to choose politics. The district didn't have any home rule, you know, that is to say, any self-government. It didn't have any member of Congress. So I couldn't have chosen politics. There was no politics. The federal government ran the District of Columbia. That's just, so we were not inferior when it came to race. We were very inferior when it came to democracy.
So your study of the law, your professoriate at Georgetown, eventually you find yourself in Congress. That becomes your field, your place of making the world better.
I didn't even conceive of myself going to Congress. My first exposure to public office really came out of my work, I think, in the Civil Rights Movement, when I was appointed to chair the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That was really the first public office I had, not as an elected official, but as an official appointed by the President of the United States.
As you moved from that appointed office to elected office, what do you consider to be the limits of what you can do as an elected official? I think many times the public depends on the elected officials to do everything. What, in your experience, would you name as the limits?
Well, I am really constrained by democracy. I can't get but so far out in front of my people. So public officials can't just decide willy-nilly what do I like to do this morning. You better be in touch with the people you represent. And the last time I was in touch with the people I represented, they told me they wanted to be the 51st state of the United States of America.
And so How can we help to make that happen? With you doing your work where you are, what is the work that you conceive of that we could be doing to push H.R. 51, to make this dream legislation statehood?
Well, Reverend Lamar, that's a very interesting question. I want to thank, because I see residents here who have often carried this burden by themselves. It's been a burden because it's been 218 years without full democracy in the District of Columbia. But help is on the way. I had a press conference today with representatives of almost 100 organizations who have track records in passing legislation, who are on board to help us to become the 51st state, and their first mission is to help us fill the rafters on July 24th for the first hearing. We want to invite everybody here to come to the House of Representatives. We want to make it so they got to open up all kinds of hearing rooms, and just to contain the number of residents who come to the Capitol at this hearing to demand that this bill go to the floor this year on our way to becoming the state of Washington, not the city that we are today.
Now, in your effort to move us towards statehood, you have some allies that we would not normally consider allies for certain causes. Could you share with us some interesting bedfellows, allies who are supporting this?
I'm not sure. I wish I could say they were Republican allies.
Are there any who have come up to support that are outside of the mainstream of support that you would get for something like this? Are there typically the usual suspects helping to support statehood?
Well, Reverend Lamar, we have almost enough co-sponsors to pass this law now. Now that's really something, since most bills that go to the House floor don't have anything near the 218 co-sponsors it takes to pass a bill. I think we have 213. Most bills that go to the House floor, we are sure going to pass. But it's not because everybody in the House has signed on to the bill. And we are very pleased because signing on to the DC statehood bill have also been freshmen who flipped the House. These people come from states where they won the House by 1, 2, or 3 percentage points. And yet slowly they too are coming on. Bear in mind that most Americans think we have the same rights they do. This is my greatest frustration. They do not understand. I think they believe it is inconceivable that there are Americans who don't have the same right to have senators and to have representatives and to have people not interfering with their business. Remember, they are not plastered to the television on the channels that show the proceedings of the House of Representatives with me on the floor. They know very little about the Capitol of the United States. So they are astonished. That's why these national organizations, Reverend Lamar, mean so much to us, because they can carry the message far beyond where we are able to carry it. It's not as if we've been keeping this to ourselves. It shows you what it takes to go nationwide with a message like this. And that is what is beginning to happen now, as we can see that we have begun to nationalize H.R. 51.
Well, just a couple of facts for those of us who may not be aware that you were able to secure the first ever vote on the floor for a DC statehood bill in 1993. and that when the Committee on Oversight and Reform holds its hearing on July 24th, and please make note of July 24th, everyone, that's when we want to be up on the Hill. It will be the first House hearing on DC statehood since 1993, so we thank you for your leadership.
Well, Reverend Lamar, and I should say, when I first came to the House floor, to the House of Representatives, it was a very different House of Representatives. We had the majority, but many of them were Southern Democrats. I will always remember Tom Foley, who was the Speaker of the House, because I told him I wanted a vote on DC statehood, knowing full well that I couldn't get all of the Democrats because some of them were Southern Democrats. Now, I should explain that Southern Democrats were good Democrats, but they were conservative Democrats. So I wasn't going to be able to get them for DC voting rights, and Tom Foley, nevertheless, allowed me to have that first vote ever on DC statehood. We didn't get the majority. We got more than anyone anticipated. I forget the vote now. But what happened is the next term, Republicans took over the House of Representatives, and it has been my bad luck to have been in the minority for most of my service in the Congress, which is why it matters so much to us that we've been able now to get so many co-sponsors and to look forward to enacting H.R. 51.
So we're about the business of building allies for the cause. What is the biggest resistance to DC becoming a state? It seems obvious to many, but we'd like to hear from you. Those who are opposed, vehemently opposed, what is the source of their opposition?
Well, the biggest resistance is the division between Democrats and Republicans. Don't let that worry you. It shouldn't worry you. You have to ask yourself, how did the states get into the Union? That was that division as well. The last states to get into the Union were Hawaii and Alaska, and it got into the Union because one was Democratic and one was Republican, and now they've switched. We don't have a partner like that now. I don't know how many of you remember when we did, at least for the House vote, Tom Davis, a Republican from Virginia who retired some years ago. He wasn't voted out, he just retired. Representative Conley represents his district now. He believed that the district should have a vote in the People's House. And he and I worked together and got Republicans on a bill for the House vote, that's halfway home, by pairing us with Utah. Utah had just missed getting a vote, and they were indignant because the reason they missed getting the vote was that their young people who are religiously obligated to be missionaries for 2 years were for the first time not counted. So Tom Davis thought that they would work with us if they could get a vote and we could get a vote. And I am telling you that Utah, one of the most Republican states in the Union, teamed with us. The governor came to testify for a vote for Utah and a vote for DC. To be clear, we got those votes through the House and the Senate, and the only reason we do not have the full vote on the House floor now is that the National Rifle Association got somebody to attach a rider that would have wiped out all of DC's gun laws in return for a vote. That was an offer we had to refuse. That was why we lost that opportunity, so now we're going for broke.
We're supposed to also tonight talk about community. What does it mean to build community to you? What does that mean?
Well, building community has meant everything to the district. and particularly to H.R. 51 and to voting rights. Remember, I have not been in the majority for most of my time in the Congress. I have had to get what I get for the district by working with Republicans. Some of you may know DC TAG, tuition access grants. I couldn't have gotten that bill without working with Republicans. But what has kept DC statehood alive? It is people like the people in this church tonight that even when we were in the minority never gave up because they went to the community and made it clear that only the community could make this happen. So now you've heard me talk about how national organizations are coming forward. But what has made DC DC statehood possible is the way in which this community has never given up on empowering themselves as Americans equal to all other Americans.
How would you challenge members of the faith community here tonight to support H.R. 51? What could we be doing more of to strengthen the cause and the effort?
I must say, Reverend Lamar, you have set the example for what the church could be doing. When I was a child, the most important institution that was leading the district toward home rule were its churches. Churches were then in the leadership. So I would like to see other churches in DC follow your example and understand that their own leadership has always been critical to every step we have taken along the way. And that if they follow your leadership and understand that it is not the forces of civic leadership that alone can bring us to where we need to be. Just as we've always needed the church in the 218 years that there's been a District of Columbia, we need the church now if we're to get full statehood.
What argument would you continue to make to churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, ethical, humanists, whomever? We exist to serve our theological priorities by serving the community. If DC were a state, how might we better be able to serve the constituents that elect you and who populate our houses of worship?
Well, I think if we were a state, the way in which you might be better able to serve is that to the extent that the church is always in service of people, for example, in service of making sure that the Congress of the United States does the right thing about the poor and the homeless, the church in this city would have 2 senators and not only a representative to go to, in order to make sure that those who look to you for leadership, who look to you of the church for much that they need, that you would have the full panoply of what it takes to deliver for constituents who come to you the way they come to members of Congress.
Now, I've lived in the city for 5 years. This is your home. How would you say the city has changed? To many of us, it's changed. Change has been cataclysmic. What markers of change do you see in the city that you wish to share with us? What's different about the Washington of today?
Well, some in the church tonight will remember that the district had very hard times. Because the district is the only city in the United States that carries state functions, the city at one point became insolvent. It was losing population, by the way. The moment it became insolvent, people began to leave the district in very large numbers. One of the reasons I was able to get DC TAG, the tuition access grants, which allow our youngsters to go to any state-supported institution in the United States with $10,000 given by the federal government. One of the reasons I was able to get that bill was to try to keep residents in the District of Columbia. If you go way back to that troubled period, some of you I still meet people who had the $5,000 home buyer credit. That is a credit I got which helped people remain in the District of Columbia because they got that credit that was valuable here and no place else. So it is worth remembering that the prosperous DC that you see today is coming back from the dead. Now we have the opposite problem. We applaud the growth in population. That's not our problem. But this is a city with no way to expand, and worse, it has a height limit. So to accommodate added population, we can't build high because of the presence of the federal establishment, the monument, and the like. Therefore, it is no wonder that the district leads the country with a gentrifying crisis, because with nowhere to go, even up, the inevitable result is that the cost of housing becomes astronomical. So you may see new people moving into the District of Columbia, but if they are young people, and most of them are, they will tell you, yeah, they live down on the new housing that's being built for one with 4 people living in it, roommates. It's happening all over the United States. But because of a special circumstance, as a city with no state to widen out, no suburbs, this is it, this is all you get, and no ability to build up, the gentrification crisis is amplified in the city.
I just want to ask you, stay there for one moment, the issue of displacement, how difficult it is for poor and working people to remain in the city, the market realities that drive housing prices beyond the reach of people who work hard every day. What is it that you can do and are doing from Congress? What is it that we can do to make sure that this remains a city where working people and poor people can live here? Because you would not have the city we have if it were not possible for those who came here during the Great Migration to stay, to settle, to own property, for their families to thrive over generations. That is not happening as it once did. It seems to be disappearing, and that for us is problematic. So how can you help? How can we help?
Well, housing is not like food stamps. It will not be funded by the federal government. Housing is a market commodity. Therefore, I can get, though expansion I have not been able to get, and you won't get expansion of it, but Section 8 housing. Some federal funding for Section 8 housing. There is public housing. Now I'm running out of what the government will do for housing. The reason that gentrification is so serious is precisely because housing depends almost entirely on the market, and the market goes where the housing is. And the housing is here, but the wherewithal to pay for the housing is certainly not here among many residents of the District of Columbia. If you have a house, hold on to it, you're rich. If you don't have a house, it will be difficult to buy one in the District of Columbia today.
Part of the challenge also is when public lands become available, and again, this would happen more at the city level than at the federal level, but public lands become available, developers are able to get sometimes a large swaths at a low price, sweetheart deals, or public housing is removed. And
no, public housing cannot be moved by federal.
When the buildings are taken away, when they are raised, and market rate housing comes and replaces it, often there is not the housing to replace the residents who've been displaced. They get vouchers. And I have met Washington residents who now live in West Virginia, who live all over because the vouchers will not allow them to live at home. They have to go out. And so
Yeah, vouchers are very scarce because the people who are in public Section 8 housing are not going to move. So you can have a voucher, but it won't do you much good.
Not here.
Certainly not in this city. And it's almost impossible to expand Section 8 housing. Section 8 housing is private housing. If somebody has housing and they see what this market is, well, they want to sell that housing, that building, to make it into total private housing. And you cannot keep them from doing that in a capitalist or a market economy.
Could you say something about how statehood and criminal justice intersect? I mean, we don't have our own state's attorney, but instead we have a U.S. attorney. And how has the criminal justice system run amok here because we don't have control? Help us to understand in plain language how that affects our brothers and sisters here.
Even before we get statehood, I have a bill to give the district its own local DA. We do have our own criminal justice system. That is to say, the council passes the criminal laws and decides what should be criminal, what should not. And this is a progressive city. But I would really not blame it on the U.S. attorney. Criminal justice in the District of Columbia, most of our criminal matters go to the Superior Court. That is our local court, and are decided there. And yet, I should say, Reverend Lamar, since you raised it, we have peculiar problems of criminal matters. I'm having I had a town meeting recently because of my concern that the district had an increase in shootings while most big cities did not. So we're going, we don't know why. We have no reason. We know one reason is that Virginia is close by and they don't have the tight gun laws we have, because these guns come up mostly from the South. But this is a special problem in DC. Its crime rate is going up again, shootings are going up again, and no one, not even the best analysts, have been able to correlate why crime goes up in some places and not in other places. But we are having something of a crisis on that matter in the city today.
Besides having 2 senators in the Senate and having a representative in Congress, what might be some of the other tangible outcomes for statehood for those of us who are residents of the district?
Well, Reverend Lamar, I am not waiting for statehood to get us the other tangible parts. I'm on a 2-track system.
Okay.
One is simply to fill out home rule. I'll give you an example. The DC National Guard. We don't need statehood to get control of the National Guard. I have a bill that could get us control of the National Guard. Now that I'm in the majority, I'm doing all I can to get that bill through the House and Senate. So I am trying to get the district full democracy on what I call a 2-track system. If you got statehood tomorrow, presto, you would have it. But there must be other avenues to equalize matters in our city, and one of them is to go the full freight for home rule. And much of what we need, U.S. attorney, a DA rather than a U.S. attorney, we could get without statehood. So we can't tell the future of statehood, so we need to go for what we can get today. And that has been the way I have operated in Congress all along. For example, we have a statue of Frederick Douglass. You're not supposed to have one because we're not a state. So you don't let what they call you keep you from getting what you think you're entitled to. And I'm going for a second statue. The residents of the District of Columbia voted for 2 statues. We got Frederick Douglass, and there was every reason to have Frederick Douglass. He was a fierce fighter for equality for the District of Columbia. And now we have the residents voted that the second one should be Pierre L'Enfant. Watch me. We're going to get that second one. You can't be hemmed up by what they say about you. And that's the DC tradition.
So inevitably, statehood comes, and the history of the District of Columbia, like so many places, as you said, this was, as the book says, a southern town, a sleepy southern town. There are communities where persons paid taxes, but their communities were disinvested in. They never got the infrastructure that they paid for. They were not treated fairly by politics nor by policy. What can be done if statehood comes, should it comes? And I'm sure you're working this on 2 tracks as well, to make sure those communities which have been disinvested and have
those
not
communities
shared
outside of the district, I'm
no,
sorry.
within the district. So particularly communities, black communities, brown communities, poor communities, that studies show have not been invested in as far as infrastructure, education. Things are changing now. There are investments in places in the city where persons did not get investments before. How can we make sure that with the dawning of statehood, communities that have suffered disinvestment and violent policies that kept them from enjoying the fullness of the citizenship investment that they were making, what can we do to make sure that statehood doesn't leave folks behind?
Well, we're already making progress on that score. You look around you in downtown Washington, you say, well, what made downtown Washington grow with so many amenities and become a place where people want to go? Well, it wasn't the federal government. It was the federal government. The federal government was located here, and the city grew up around downtown Washington. Across the river in Wards 7 and 8, the federal government had never taken a federal agency. Well, they're taking 6 now. It owns the St. Elizabeth's West Campus. I think it's West Campus. The East Campus is owned by the District of Columbia. Well, we need a place for the Department of Homeland Security, which consists of about 6 different agencies. We already have the Coast Guard in Ward 8. Next will be FEMA, and you will see Ward 8 get what downtown Washington got, what the area around this church, Metropolitan A.M.E, got. You will see amenities begin to be located there because federal workers bring amenities. So we are working very closely with our residents across the river who are about to see the federal government finally cross the river and build there as they have built downtown Washington.
And I think it'll be incumbent upon the faith community to ensure that as those people come bringing jobs and infrastructure, that people who already live there are not forced out, because inevitably that will mean rising prices and rising property value, rising taxes. And so it'll be incumbent upon us to make sure that our neighbors...
And I should say there is already a very active effort, and this is before the federal government's barely gotten there, to buy homes and to help people who have homes remain in their homes. In other words, people across the river are learning from what gentrification or even the presence of the federal government could do to your community and how to fight back.
So we're coming toward the end of our hour of communication and questions. Your time is coming. I believe there are cards that are being passed out. If they're going to be passed out, please write your questions down, and you all will get more information from me in a moment as to how to make sure that your questions are gathered and they are asked. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. One question I have as well, I've been in a lot of groups where you have good conversation as we've had, and people leave thinking, what can I do? So a question that we often ask is, what's the next fateful step? So for those of us who want to help HR 51, who want to help statehood come to the district, what's the one thing that we can do when we leave here tonight to make that happen as individuals, as a collective? What's the next faithful step for us?
Well, residents have already done the most important. I would not be pressing a statehood bill if the residents hadn't voted for statehood overwhelmingly. So in thinking about what you can do, remember, residents are located in this city, and that's been the problem. They haven't been able to fan the entire country. That's why these almost 100 organizations are going to be useful to us. So if we're looking at what is the next thing you can do to be helpful, it is come to the House of Representatives on Thursday, July the 24th, and show them we mean it. We want statehood for the District of Columbia.
Excellent. How many of you will be there on July 24th? Let me see a show of hands, those who are there. And I do want to thank, if you are a clergy person in the district, would you please stand? We want to thank you for your presence, all the clergy people here from the district. Thank you all very much. And want to acknowledge Reverend Thomas Bowen with the mayor's office, faith-based office. Good to see you tonight, sir. Thank you for your presence. Also, those of you who belong to any congregations in the city, would you raise your hands? We want to thank you all for your presence here tonight. What else would you like to share, Congresswoman? I've asked you a lot of questions.
Well, actually, I'd like to hear what people are thinking.
Excellent, excellent.
Now that we're close to the first hearing,
okay.
I need to hear back from the people I represent.
So I believe Karen, if we're correct, people can just come to the microphones. All right. So if you have a question, please come to the microphones. There's one here, one here. If you don't mind, I have a long history in being a referee. And so we'd ask you to ask questions. Please do not give dissertations. So ask questions. If you're not asking a question, I will lovingly gesture you away from the microphone or encourage you to ask a question. So again, this is not a time to not ask questions. Please ask your questions and we'll direct those to the Congresswoman. Thank you very much. Reverend Shannon, good to see you, sir.
Thank you very, very much. I want to commend our Congresswoman for all that she does for the good of our city.
Could you take the microphone, hold it closer to you, sir? Thank you.
I want to commend our Congresswoman for all that she does for the advancement of our city. My question is this. I watched the state of hate in our country last night on CNN. And I'm aware of the division that has taken place in our country. My question is, do you think, and if so, to what extent does racism serve as a barrier to our becoming a state? Racism. And I'll wait for your answer.
Well, I'm so pleased you asked that question. The question is, to what extent does racism stand as a barrier to our becoming the 51st state? I should make this clear. It is true that the district was a segregated city and that it was not a city where black and white together we shall not be moved. But when it comes to our disenfranchisement, blacks and whites alike were disenfranchised. Black people led the movement, however, for home rule and for democracy. But in this city, it was across the board. Nobody could vote for any member of Congress. The white people couldn't vote either. Nobody had a mayor, white or black. So if we haven't all been, if we don't know we're all in this together in the district, it's time we found out. And perhaps it's why the district has had a generally more progressive white population than many southern states.
Thank you. Next person.
Thank you.
Thank you. On this side. Yes, ma'am.
Is this on? You hear me? Yes. First, I want to give glory to God for allowing me to be here. And how you doing, my friend, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton? My name is Dorothy Douglas. I'm also Ward 7 Democrat State Committee woman. and ANC Commission 7003. My question is, why is City Council giving developers over $1 million? The residents don't have no input on how this money is being spent. These are our tax dollars. Developers come into our community, they move in, and they force us out of our property and out of our homes. This has been going on for years and years. You're going to give a $30 million lease to a developer and have not talked to the community, have not had a hearing, and the city council and the mayor sign off without our input or transparency. We said no, but they're still going forward. We've been not told what's going on, and this is an ongoing thing that's going on for years.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Well, fortunately, you do have democracy in the District of Columbia, but you have asked me a question about the City Council, and I am your member of Congress, so I cannot tell you why the City Council did this or that, but I can tell you this. You have the right to redress from your City Council, unlike having the full redress from the Congress of the United States.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, nice to meet you in person.
No, it wasn't an
Congresswoman.
answer, but I'm just saying.
Sorry, ma'am.
No, I just want to say it wasn't. But those are our fellow dollars that are being used, our
Yes,
tax
ma'am.
dollars. We
Thank
just
you.
want to know how can they just
It will. We're going to move on, ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, we had been in touch by communications.
A little
we
louder,
had
ma'am.
been in
Speak up a
touch
little.
by mail, and I had talked with Trent Holbrook in your office concerning the drug issue. The drug issue.
Drug issue.
Yes, and the opioid crisis.
The opioid crisis, yes.
Right, and you mentioned your concern about violence and wondered why there was an increase. I have done an extensive analysis of this kind of problem in the major metropolitan areas in this country, and I think I have some insights for you on this. I just gave a presentation. My name is, by the way, is Paula Gordon, and I have a website called GordonDrugAbusePrevention.com. I just gave a presentation to the Drug
I think we got your
Enforcement
question.
Administration. And
Could you tell me what your question is for
The
me?
question-
Yes, I want you to respond to this theory about what is happening in cities like Denver, Seattle, New York City even, Los Angeles, San Francisco,
How about DC?
San Diego, and DC. What is happening with respect to the increase in violence and its connection to the increase in addiction.
Thank you, ma'am.
And the connection between the legalization of marijuana and the increasing use of marijuana with the increase in violence, which is now in the scientific literature well established. You can see it on my website,
Well,
Thank you, ma'am. Excuse me.
GordonDrugAbusePrevention.com.
Thank you, ma'am. We have your question. Thank you.
Well, I don't know of any instances where somebody was convicted of a crime and found to have been using marijuana. In any case, the District of Columbia is a democracy, and it has decided that it is better to legalize marijuana than to do what we found we were doing. 90% of those arrested for smoking marijuana were African Americans. When that statistic came out, the district legalized marijuana.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks for a great conversation between you. Really educational. Great meeting in general. First, on community identification and community solidarity. Maybe you recall, Ms. Norton, I'm trying to get my ANC 6D and every other ANC in the District of Columbia.
That may be
to
my
come-
ANC. Go ahead.
to come out officially, making official proclamations, each ANC for statehood for the District of Columbia.
I love
Now-
that suggestion, because it says that Eleanor is not just speaking for herself, she's speaking for residents, and you're hearing directly from them. So thank you for that.
Now, something was left out in the conversation. Could you please inform whomever still doesn't know it, there's something called an Office of DC Statehood. And in connection with the existence of that office, there's a phone bank process and a phone bank program. And I've been talking about the issue of national awareness. I've been talking with people, I've been phoning people in Nevada. Notice my pronunciation of the Nevada. I've been talking to Nevadans and people from all over the country about the need for DC statehood, where, for instance, we send people into military service where they get hurt and where they get killed, never having had the chance to vote like people in every other state in the union votes.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for coming. I am 84 years old. I went to Dunbar as well. My concern is I work at the DC jail, and I see a lot of young people there. And at this point, they're tearing down all around the jail, and the sewage is coming into the jail. It's just a mess over there. And I would like to know what can be done to make it habitable for those people who live there. They have no place to go.
Thank you,
Well,
ma'am.
again, I appreciate the question, but again, it's a question that is more likely to be addressed to the DC Council and the mayor. I can tell you that the DC Council, and I think it may even be in this year's budget, is trying to build a new jail for the District of Columbia.
Sir.
However, may I
Yes,
say this, please? However, in the front of the jail, they're building a big condominium, whatever, where these people, and when they whatever they're doing over there, the sewage comes into the jail when they are doing whatever they do over there with that big monstrosity they're building.
Thank you, ma'am.
I'm not sure what you're speaking about that's being built by the District of Columbia.
you.
All I know is that money has been appropriated for a new jail for the District of Columbia.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'm tired of being a subject. I want to be a citizen. I tell everybody who's calls me for money from other states, you speak to your person who is running and say, I will support you if you are willing to sign a pledge to make the District of Columbia a state. Now, I remember when we were fighting the last battle on this, and I remember a couple of things that worked and some things that didn't work. The thing that worked when we were trying to get rid of Johnny Mac was we got Christmas card lists from people in the state where he was from, and we managed to get a whole lot of Christmas card lists, and we contacted them and had them make sure that they went out and voted when Johnny Mac was running. You know this, of course, Eleanor, because you were
Ma'am, excuse me
around.
one moment. Just so that we have a lot of people, if you would get to your question, please, I need to be a little tighter. So if you have a question, would you ask it, please?
Okay. I want to know how we are going to work with the state legislatures around the country who are unaware of our situation.
Well, that's an important question.
Thank you.
And you talked about the way we used to have to do it. But the way we do it now is we go on IT. We use the new technology. For example, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on all of those sites. And that is a fast way to educate the public. And it's a very important vehicle so that we don't have to do what we had to do to write to people to say, although we would welcome what their state legislatures, if their state legislatures would pass resolutions, we would certainly welcome that. That's a very important way to send a message back to the Congress. So if you would like to, please, for those that you've been in touch with, say, go for a resolution from your state for statehood for the District of Columbia. We'd very much appreciate it.
Thank you. And going forward, if you would just go right to your question, please. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to know if you could talk a little bit about how statehood would affect programs like DC Tag.
She asked a very telling question. How statehood would affect programs like DC Tag. I indicated that I got DC Tag when we were going bankrupt. And that the federal government essentially pays to send out students to college in all 50 states. You get $10,000 a year, and most state colleges don't cost any more than that. I mean, if you're going to Berkeley, you may have to put up some yourself, or Michigan, but that will do it. And it has done its job. It's kept people in the District of Columbia. Our students are in every state of the union. I cannot, there will be changes. There will be things we pay for. For example, you don't pay for your jail. They go to the Bureau of Prisons. We're going to have to pay for that. There will be changes, and I cannot guarantee that we will be able to keep DC Tag, since we got DC Tag because we were insolvent, and nobody can claim that the district, what is it, a $3 billion surplus, is insolvent now, but they haven't tried to take DC Tag yet. Nevertheless, if the DC statehood bill passes, one of the things the district is going to have to do is to look at whether it is a state or a city. And if it's a state, it's going to have to act like a state, and it may not get DC Tag. So I alert you. I'm holding on to it as long as we can. This has been very important, I should say.
Thank you.
To the residents of the District of Columbia, because we are a town that if you don't have at least some college, it's hard to get a job in this city. So it has meant everything to the district to have DC Tag.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Bo Schuff with DC Vote. I want to acknowledge the other local organizations that are here just really super fast. Stand Up for Democracy in DC, Free DC. I saw Herd on the Hill. I saw ACLU DC. I think Statehood Federation is here. If I missed anybody, I apologize. I just want to provide a resource to the audience. Showup4dc.com, which is the number 4. So showup, the number 4, dc.com is going to give you all the information about the hearing, logistics, how to get in the building, where to go. Show up wearing red and white. If you can't make the hearing, wear red and white that day and reach out to us on social media. So my question is to everyone here, even if you can't come to the hearing, who will participate with us on July 24th to make sure everybody in DC knows that we are going to show up for DC? Who can be there? Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. And
yes,
thank you for naming all the organizations, or many of the organizations, who have helped us get where we are today.
Good evening, Congresswoman Norton. I'm here with the Armenian National Committee of America. We just wanted to thank you very much for being a vital member on the Armenian Caucus and for promoting Armenian American issues on Capitol Hill. We also support your fight to get H.R. 51 through Congress, so thank you very much. My question is, in the case that H.R. 51 gets passed by Congress, which we highly hope it does, what do you think the addition of 2 senators and a representative in Congress, how would that affect the power dynamics on Capitol Hill in terms of protecting the people's interests of DC?
Having 2 senators would be very important for the district. Even when I get a bill passed in the House, and I have been voted the most effective House Democrat for getting bills passed, I have to go to the Senate to get them really passed and sent to the president. Which one of our bills is on our way to the president now? Which is it? Huh? Oh, breastfeeding, which allows breastfeeding in federal buildings all across the United States. As a tourist town, we thought we ought to make sure that happened everywhere. So having having not to work the Senate myself, the Senate of which I am not a member, but having 2 senators would mean a great deal to the District of Columbia. It perhaps is the most important thing that we could get from statehood.
Thank you.
That we don't have now. I should say, because I do vote on the House floor now. When I first came to Congress, some of you may know that you don't have to, I had been a professor of law at Georgetown. You don't have to be a professor of law to figure this out. I vote in committee. The district has always voted in committee. The vote is like everybody else in committee. Well, when matters go to the House floor, many votes are taken in the committee of the whole. So I went to Tom Foley and said, I vote in that committee created by the House. You created the committee of the whole. Can I at least vote when bills come to the committee of the whole? And he said, well, nobody from the district has ever suggested the district ought to be able to vote on the House floor, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to send that to outside counsel. Outside counsel said, the analogy is correct. We believe she can vote in the committee of the whole. Tom Foley, then the Speaker of the House, gave me, or they voted to give me the vote in the committee of the whole. The Republicans sued the House for giving DC the vote in the committee of the whole. They lost in the district court, so they said, we'll fix you, we're going to the Court of Appeals. They went to the Court of Appeals and they lost again. And they didn't have the nerve to go to the Supreme Court. So I was able to vote in the committee of the whole, and then we lost the House. And guess what the Republicans did when the Democrats lost the House? They took away your vote in the committee of the whole. And I just got it back, and I use it every day.
Yes, sir.
Welcome, Congresswoman Norton. As you know, the Mueller report was released a while ago. He's actually coming to testify in a few weeks. He's actually coming to testify in a few weeks. That's Mr. Mueller. You can hear me now? Yeah. Not that I need to hear anything from him anymore. The report is out. I'm assuming you have read it. I've seen enough over the last 2.5 years. I'm like Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired of what's happening with the occupant at 1600 Avenue. My question is, are you willing to support Resolution 257, and are you willing to begin an impeachment inquiry fairly soon for the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? Thank you very much.
That is a very good question. This is why I have written on my Facebook page why I do not support impeachment at this time. Now, let me be very clear. This president has committed many impeachable offenses. I was in the House of Representatives when the attempt was made to impeach Bill Clinton. You want to stop all business in the House of Representatives? You want to make sure that nothing gets done? You want to take the first time we've been in the majority in 8 years and devote the next year to trying to impeach Donald Trump? Do you want to do that when the Senate is in the hands of Republicans who will never impeach him? So that kind of self-gratifying got you means you ain't got nothing, because you spent a lot of time indicting somebody that the Senate won't convict. So now I'm not for impeachment. I'm for getting something done for the residents of the District of Columbia.
If I may, in the interest of time, please just ask your question. Too much prolegomena. Straight to the question. Thank you.
Good evening. I was wondering if you would address the federal Medicaid match that would be cut from 70% to 50% in the event that DC was the 51st state, which is about $1 billion per year, and also the ownership of the judicial system, which is about $600 million per year, And how are we expected to pay for that when we already have an extremely expensive system of government within the District of Columbia? If you would address that, or at least discuss it. Thank you so much.
Look, statehood isn't free. You want to be a state, you're going to have to act like a state. You're going to have to pay like a state. You got a $3 billion surplus. We can afford to be a state. The last thing I need to do is to say to the Congress, I'm sorry, give us a state, make us a state, but believe me, we sure can't afford to be a state. There are 2 states that have fewer people than the district. Vermont and Wyoming, I never heard them say we don't want to be a state. They don't have nearly the kind of income we have. We are the capital of the United States. That brings millions of dollars, billions of dollars every year. Just because people come here, lay those dollars down here, because this is the capital of the United States, we won't lose this. This gentleman is absolutely right. I was able to get Medicaid lowered, as a part of our bill to take the district out of insolvency. We are going to have to pay. And I believe we can afford to pay. This is not 10 years ago when the district was insolvent. Yes, this is a city that is in gentrification. So is New York, so is Chicago. I don't hear those people saying, therefore, make us a ward of the federal government. We don't get anything out of the federal government. We have to pay the same per capita as everybody else. They don't give us anything, but what they have done is take these state functions, some of them off, and yeah, they're going to hand them back to us. And yes, statehood is going to cost us some money. I can look at you and say, I don't think I'm looking at a poor state. I'm not looking at a state so poor that it can't afford to become a state.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I had a broader policy question. As a new resident in D.C., I'm with the Armenian National Committee and starting, coincidentally, at Georgetown Law. And what I wanted to point out is, unfortunately, we do live in a society where certain human rights issues, such as the Holocaust, or say the Rwandan genocide and the Armenian genocide, still do go ignored. So what I wanted to know was, what has your record been on these issues as a representative, and how do you imagine a state of D.C. might vote about these issues going forward?
Which issues have you in mind?
So again, specifically denial as it pertains to the Armenian genocide.
Denial of what?
The Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, and the Rwandan genocides.
Oh, that's not a matter that comes before the House or Senate. That denial has been going on
certainly
for a very long time. That doesn't, I think I'm on a bill against that. That doesn't get the imprimatur of the House or the Senate, I'm pleased to say.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Mariana Barros, and I'm with Neighbors United for DC Statehood today. I have a quick question to your point about how the rest of the nation does not really understand the concept that there are 700,000 people living in the District of Columbia. How do you have plans to make that an election year issue, a topic that people are talking about nationally as we're going into the presidential election in 2020? And moreover, if you have you found any messaging that could help civic organizations and community organizations like Neighbors United for DC to help people empathize with our cause?
Well, I think we should make a big hay of the fact that, remember when the mayor said he wanted to grow the district by 100,000 residents? We're past that now. I think we were 100,000 residents, we're past that now. So the district is growing like a wildfire. And I think you're right. Just as they don't know, we don't have the vote, they don't understand how this city is growing. And yes, we ought to make sure that they understand our population is expanding for a very good reason, because this is a very good city to call home.
Yes, sir.
Hello. I was just wondering how you think we could leverage the presidential election, especially considering Cory Booker is from DC, to promote statehood nationally.
Let me see. Corey.
He was born in DC.
Was he born in D.C.?
He was born in D.C.
He may have been born in D.C.
He was born in D.C.
I don't think that'll help us unless he becomes the president. But he's a good friend, and he, like everybody running for, all of the Democrats running for president are co-sponsors of the D.C. statehood bill in the Senate. Sir?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you. Are there any mothers here today? If there are any mothers, can they please stand real quick? Any moms? Please stand, just please stand real quick.
How about grandmas?
I wanted to know, based on some of the topics that we spoke today, speaking on there's 30,000 evictions going on in DC every year, gentrification is a plague. What are you going to do to protect mothers in our homes here in the district with this bill? What would this bill do to protect us? Because
protecting mothers or protecting residents?
We need to stand together on one platform to protect mainly the ones that built this city, Black mothers. Black mothers built this city on their backs.
Protect them from what?
From gentrification, from developers. We've talked about it all here today. A lot of us are here because we're losing our homes. You've seen this population change in this city over the 20 more years that you've been here.
I beg to differ. Most people are not losing their homes. The reason that people are sitting on top of a fortune. So if you come to somebody who owns a home and offers them 4 or 5 times what they paid for it, people are selling their homes. And that is what has happened to the District of Columbia. They're sitting on a lot of money. And some of these are elderly residents. And that's the way in which the market works. People don't have to keep their homes if they can get more out of them. And that is something we can't do very much about. We've talked about gentrification here already. It's one thing to be against it. It's another thing to understand that the government will never rescue you from gentrification, because housing is a commodity. And I mentioned before, it's not like food stamps, and so we are trapped. But we're not the only ones trapped, and many of us are looking for ways out of this and have not been able to find it. I do have a bill that would finally give us back a bill, by the way, the district is willing to buy RFK Stadium. That's the last big tract of land. That is a place where you could put some affordable housing, and the district says that's one of the things it wants to do with that. So you've raised a very important issue. I'm just sorry I don't have the key to it in the Congress of the United States.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Johnny Scott Rice. I live east of the river. I have 2 issues. Charter schools. They're killing DC public schools with these charter schools, because that money is coming out of the DC public school budget for these kids to go to these charter schools. I live in Fort DuPont. I grew up in Trinidad. All of a sudden, Trinidad is now Capitol Hill East, not on my lot and deed. And we were in that house in 1949. I'm 78 years old, and we still own it. Let me explain something to you. They built Rocket Ship Charter School in Ward 8 next door to a halfway house. How you do that? How do you get a permit for that? They built one next door to us. We didn't even know it was coming. And the next thing we know, there it is, looking down in our bedrooms.
Okay, you got to crawl. You got to crawl with the residents of the district. I don't have anything to do with the fact that the district has created charter schools. I can only tell you this, that there was a bill in to make DC we already are the only jurisdiction that has some vouchers, private school vouchers. But there was a bill to make the alternative school system for the District of Columbia vouchers. We already had at that point a couple of charter schools. Speaker Gingrich said, well, rather than spread vouchers saying that's your alternative school system, if you have some charter schools, we'll set up a charter school board. And yeah, and well, then you've got a beef with the District of Columbia. But let me tell everybody here, you've also got a beef with the residents of the District of Columbia, because almost half the children in the District of Columbia have chosen charter schools. So you got to straighten that out among yourselves. Don't bring that beef to me in the Congress. I didn't have anything to do with that.
Let me mention also, on September 11th, we're hosting a forum on school choice here. We invite you to join us here on September 11th at a forum for school choice. Reverend Ware, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Just a quick question, just in terms of, we know that the gentrification is happening, and with that, there is a rising in racial tension. So how do we manage that racial tension before it overflows into something that is incredibly unfortunate?
I have not seen a rise in racial tension with gentrification. For one thing, if so, it's something we should be first and foremost against. That's against the DC values. Even when we were a segregated city, there was not racial tension. There was resentment that the city was segregated. But I don't think that we're going to blame one another for the problems we have. And that's been one of the great joys of representing residents of the District of Columbia, that I have not seen this as a city with racial tension. I have seen racial problems. I think it is a racial problem when people can't find affordable housing, until I look and see that white people can't find it either. And I think we just have to join together to make sure that this city, that even when this was a segregated city, and it really should be pointed out, when I was a kid growing up in this city, it did not have racial tension. The white people who lived here were always more progressive than the white people who lived down south. So I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful that our city has not, in fact, gone at one another, black versus white. If we do, I'll be the first one to stand up and say, no, you don't, not in our town.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name's Karen Williams, and I'm Operations Director for Heard on the Hill. We're a DC nonprofit of citizen advocates who work with Congress. And this is my question. As a leader in a progressive organization that has a national reach, what is the most influential or impactful action that we can ask of citizens in other states to communicate support for H.R. 51 with their own reps in Congress?
Well, I think you've named it. If you have that kind of outreach to other states, remembering how difficult it is, I've talked about going on Facebook. By the way, maybe somebody can help me here. I have tried, I have, almost every meeting I raise this issue. I would like to have a group of people, it could be only a half dozen people, who would help us send out a message, let's say twice a week, on DC statehood or on what DC is. If we could do that, we could have a coordinated message to educate the country, but I've never been able to get that group of people assembled. And we could all agree on what the message of the week or the message would be for this day. And I think with using Facebook, using IT and all of that together, there's no better way to reach the Congress than online, to reach the country than online. Thank you.
All right, let's coordinate with
she volunteers. Would you speak to my staff before you go to see if we can get a group? We always have one or two people to stand up and then no follow through. This is easy to do. And we will work closely with you. I can't do it because the House ethics rules keeps me from doing it, but you can do it for us, and so we will get your stuff before we leave here. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Hello, Congresswoman Norton. My question is, there is a 51 for 51 movement where a 51 Senate
Some
majority...
of them may be here. They were at the meeting that I had in the House today, where we had we have now almost 100 organizations who are helping us get DC statehood, and this 51 for 51. Why don't you tell them what 51 for 51 is?
Yeah, so the 51 Senate majority would make DC the 51st state. And so I was just wondering, do you think that's a path to statehood? And if not, if the Senate decides to do that, if we have a Democratic majority, would you give their blessings?
Well, this 51 for 51 is trying to deal with the filibuster and say for DC statehood, given that we're talking about the capital of the United States, we're talking about 218 years of trying to get home rule, 51% ought to be enough to get it done. It is a very sophisticated organization. It is on the ground in the states. And while I can't tell you that the Senate is willing to give up the filibuster, I think that is the kind of pressure it needs, and I thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
So, Congresswoman Norton, HR 51 is very exciting for folks here in DC. What about our fellow Americans who also lack representation? People who are in other U.S. territories that don't have the vote, or people who live in large states whose votes count less than votes in smaller states. So what about statehood for Puerto Rico? And what about expanding the size of the House to, say, 700 members so that the votes of Californians count as much as those of people in Wyoming?
Well, Californians counting as much as small states, the framers settled that issue more than 200 years ago. We're not going to be able to do anything about that. What? In the House? In what? Oh, a larger house. Very difficult to, very difficult to get. But you asked an important question about the five or six territories who also were given the same vote I got, but who are very different from the residents of this city. Some of them have so little population that it would be difficult for them to be a state at all. But Puerto Rico, if it were a state, would probably have 4 or 5, they're losing population because of climate change, but 4 or 5 representatives. Here's the difference between Puerto Rico and the 5 territories and you. There is a quid pro quo for them. They don't pay federal income taxes. You are number 1 in federal income taxes paid to support the United States of America. So they at least have a quid pro quo. You don't have it. And therefore, they are really not the equivalent of the residents of the District of Columbia, though I do not believe in colonialism, and I believe we must find a way to bring them into the Union the way the states are.
Yes, sir.
Congressman Norton, I'm following up on DC TAG. I was a graduate of Delaware State University.
This is a TAG guy?
Yes, I am.
Where did you go, sir?
Delaware State University.
Delaware State.
I graduated in 2013, and I'm an employer now, small business owner in Ward 7. I'm working with local employment centers that deal with job readiness training. So my question to you is, how is the elimination of DC TAG going to affect those students that might not finish, and how can we improve?
How is what about DC TAG?
If we eliminate, is DC TAG eliminated, is it going to be funding for job readiness training for students that might not finish for?
Well, you don't get that. You don't get that from DC TAG. You get that because where you get that funding from?
No, I'm saying, will we improve or increase funding for job readiness training if students might not finish for funding purposes? Like, what will be improvements of DC TAG if it's eliminated?
Well, look, the district could decide to keep DC TAG. It's $10,000 a student. But as I said before, there are some things I was able to get for the district that you will lose. Yeah, you will have to take charge of prisoners. You'll have to pay for them to go. So the Bureau of Prisons now pays for that. Nothing is free, and statehood will turn out to cost money. But you will have 2 senators, and the benefits to the district of having a full voting representative in the House and full senators will mean that things will come to the district that can't possibly come now because you don't have anyone in the Senate there to represent you.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Reverend Lamar and Senator Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes. Been knowing you for a few years, and I still have the same position that I had before, and that's dealing with affordable housing. And if that's in your platform, what can we do about bringing a more awareness for affordable housing and criminal justice activities that happen around the communities? How can we bring some of those enforcement to a close now?
Thank you.
What is it you want us, the Congress, to do about that?
What position do you have as our Congress representative here in Washington, D.C., with the type of injustices that happen with them on a daily living basis, as far as their buildings not being inspected properly, as far as the crime element that happens in their environment?
Yes,
it's overwhelming.
I want to remind everybody that at least we have democracy in the District of Columbia. And you have a council that has to be responsive to you. I've seen seats change on the District of Columbia quite rapidly. But those are not matters for the Congress of the United States. It's a separation between federal matters and local District of Columbia matters.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Ruben Baez. I just moved here about 4 years ago. And my question to the Congresswoman is, this country has I'm sorry, the echo. This country has a history of having two states come in at the same time.
Two what?
Two states come in at the same time.
Yes.
So I was thinking maybe we can collaborate with Puerto Rico or something that maybe could give us more power to move forward.
Well, you certainly are right that usually it's two at a time, one Democrat and one Republican. The reason we could not pair with Puerto Rico is it would be one for maybe 5. So it wouldn't be one for one. We paired with Utah when we got that House vote because they wanted one representative. They were denied a representative, and we wanted one representative. But there's nothing out there in the territories that's one for one that way. But that's a good thought. That's how most states have gotten in.
Yes, sir.
We're just going to do it the hard way. We're getting in by ourselves.
Good evening, Congresswoman Norton. Thank you for this opportunity to be here. My name is Anthony Muhammad. I'm the Ward 8 State Committee man. When H.R. 51 passes, will you be willing to support 100% Democratic council in Washington, D.C. and get rid of the set-aside independent?
Now, I thank you for raising that question because when we become a state, you know, as home rule says, a certain number of seats have to be, 2 seats for people who are not Democrats. What? Of the non-majority party, which turns out to be Democrats, and that's because you're not a state. They can't possibly do that if you are a state. That was in getting home rule through. That was part of the Home Rule Act. That would go. Who's next?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lilia, one of our bright young congregants here. Give it up for Lilia Choice. I think she's the youngest question asker here tonight.
The what?
Her name is Lilia. She's one of our congregants. I think the youngest and probably the smartest questioner we have tonight.
My name is Lilia Choice. What are we missing out on by not being a state?
We're missing mostly out on having 2 senators to help us out in the Senate. Otherwise, I can't, not having the vote on the House floor has not kept me from being able to get things for the District of Columbia. You have to find your way around things. How many have been to the wharf? That's my bill. I can get bills passed through the Congress. Or the Capitol Riverfront, the Southeast, that is my bill. Or if you've been to Noma, that's a whole community that I've been able to get built in the district by getting that land turned over to the District of Columbia. You can't sit in the Congress and say to the residents of the District of Columbia, I'll try to find something to do for you if you all get me statehood. You just got to do what you have to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Lilia. Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. I am Reverend Dr. Sandra Butler Truesdale, a native Washingtonian, 4th generation. And I've been in this movement since its beginning, the DC statehood movement. And I was just trying to listen very carefully, and you know, Eleanor, I'm sorry, Congresswoman Norton, I try not to disagree with you. But there is tension in our communities. And the tension is there because of the gentrification. And I do realize—
the tension is there because of what?
Because of gentrification, and people are being displaced. And I'm saying that to you.
But the tension can't be, then the tension must be with the real estate developers, not among ourselves.
But it is among the developers, but it's against the developers, and it's among each other. It's tension between blacks and whites. And I'm sorry to say this to you, but as having lived in a community for more than 52 years, I am telling you that I lived in Petworth at 801 Varnum Street Northwest, 52 years. I'm in the process right now of going through probate court for property being sold at 1458 Corcoran Street, where my family has owned for 130 years. And I am telling you that there's tension. We are the last black family other than Jimmy Jones on the block. That does not, and that doesn't say that there's anything that you can do directly about it, but I just wanted to make you aware that there is tension and there is misunderstanding, and we are concerned and upset about the conditions that many of us live in. I thank you for everything that you do, because every time I ask you for something, you give it to me. I don't care what it is.
Well, this is a good friend, so I know she means that.
If I ask you to come, you come. But it just broke my heart when you say it's not there, because I live it every day. I live it every day. And now, Eleanor, I am in Southwest Washington, D.C. I live 2 blocks from that waterfront that you're talking about. I live in St. James across from the project. And I'm seeing these people being displaced. I see that stadium. They're in between 2 stadiums. And they are being moved about. I'm trying to tell you, you have to come and walk it. You can't. I walk it every day. I walk from the wall to the waterfront station. I am telling you, it's there. It's discomfort in living. I just have never, as a 4th generation Washingtonian, I have never seen anything like this in my entire life.
Let me go back. Because, I mean, if we get racial tension among ourselves because of market forces, shame on us. All right, wait a minute. For most of the 218 years of the District of Columbia, it has been a majority white city. Only in the late 1950s did the district move with whites running from the district and blacks becoming the majority population. But if you look at 218 years of district history, it was for most of those years a majority white city. Then for a fairly brief moment, when we had 70% blacks, it became a majority black city. Now it is still a majority black city, but many more whites moving in. And so pretty soon, it may not be a majority black city. But I would really wonder if this is a city which would then blame its neighbors for people who are moving in for displacement. The displacement is occurring because of market forces, and the notion that we would go against one another instead of finding ways to live together. would be a great disappointment to me. You cannot keep market forces from deciding where people will buy property. Let me also say this, because I want to make it clear, black people are not being displaced from property by white people. The majority of blacks in this town to this very day and throughout its history rented and did not own. So let's be clear. It's not that somebody moved these black people out of their houses. They didn't own the houses. This was a tough city to own a house because you had to go to a bank and get a loan. So it does not have a strong black tradition of home ownership, never has, never had it when it was a majority black city. So yeah, it's easy to see blacks leave a city where they don't own homes, and where they own, somebody will come up, as I said earlier, and offer you 4 or 5 times what you paid for the house, and you will sell it. So we've got to learn to live together instead of blaming white people. That's not who has done this. Who has done this is the way in which market forces operate, and it is a test for the District of Columbia. Will you remain a city where progressive whites and blacks can live together, or will you allow gentrification to tear you asunder? That is the challenge for the residents of the District of Columbia. I hope you will accept it.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Reverend Lamar. Good afternoon, Congresswoman Norton. Excuse me.
Just call me anything, girl.
Can you hold it back a little bit? Okay. There's 39 million people living in poverty in the United States. 111,000 live in D.C. There are thousands of people living in crime-ridden neighborhoods in the United States, including in D.C. And all I seem to hear is, what can we do for the illegal immigrants and the asylum seekers? And I'm wondering when we are going to focus on the Americans who are suffering.
I think the only reason that the newspapers are focusing on the migrants leaving South America is because it's in the news. It's not that we're doing more for them. Have you seen the television today about people drinking out of toilets? And about not having enough to eat? I don't think we're doing a damn thing for them. Excuse me, Reverend.
No, that's fine. I use that word myself.
I don't think we're doing anything for them. We're having a president who's trying to make it impossible for them to come here. Again, I'm not going to pit one American against another.
I'm not trying to pit any Americans against the other. There are plenty of Hispanic Americans. I'm talking about Americans. I'm talking about Americans who are suffering. We're sending $50 billion down to the border. That $50 billion could be spent on
I don't know
Americans.
where you get that figure from.
From the media.
All right, well, let me tell you, don't, watch out. Let me tell you, if we wanted to do something about the migrant crisis, and one of the presidential candidates has said this, we would do a big bill in order and send it to Central America. People are fleeing poverty. They are fleeing violence. The way to do that is not what Donald Trump has done. He's pulled back that little bit of money we were giving Central America. We ought to be pouring money that way so that people could feel they can live in their own country. Okay, we're in agreement now.
Dr. Byrd, good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Pastor. I'm glad you had this. Congressman Norton, I love you, have always supported you, but I would be remiss if I did not come up here and take you to task on what you just said. First of all, I'm going to put it in the form of a question. Do you not think both the federal government and local governments have a responsibility to help persons who are in communities where the market is moving so high that they can no longer afford to pay their property taxes? Do you think that is not a responsibility, before you answer, of the government? And we would be remiss if we didn't say that we're not racial tensions. I pastor Zion Baptist Church in Northwest, and I can't tell you how many black churches in this community, in the District of Columbia, who have been a part of the District of Columbia for, my church is 54 years, where this is not a racial thing, but it is a racial thing, where white folks come into our communities who have no regard for what the churches have done in the community, no regard for how much churches give to this community in terms of human wealth and development, and they want the churches out. DC has become the most non-church friendly community in the city, and it is because of gentrification. And finally, this is my last point.
Well, you're supposed to be asking questions. You're supposed to be asking questions, and I don't even know how to respond because you keep going from one thing to another. Look, the churches in the District of Columbia suffer from the fact that people have moved out of the District of Columbia, and therefore people come, but they are so loyal to their churches that they will leave Maryland and Virginia and come on Sunday morning to sit right here in this church. And so, yeah, people leave. And in terms of what are we going to do about the fact that of gentrification? I sit in the Congress where the only thing I can do is to try to get public money for public housing and money for Section 8 housing, because the United States of America does not fund people for living in their homes. There's never been such a bill, and I dare say there never will be such a bill. We have not found the answer to gentrification. It is a terrible force. It is eating up our cities. And probably the answer it certainly doesn't lie in the federal government. An example of what can be done in the district probably should do even more of this. You cannot build a building in the District of Columbia without setting aside at least 20% of the building for affordable housing for residents. Somebody did something very good, and I invite people to see if it's being done. They looked around and saw that the district was not enforcing that set aside the way it should be. But that is the way to go at the market, because the federal government has no obligation, I dare say even the district government has no obligation to fund you so you can stay in your house. I gave the analogy of it has the obligation because we fight hard for it to see that you have food stamps, and some people, the Republicans, want to take that away from us too.
Let me say this, we just have a few more moments. Reservation 13, which is where RFK is, which is where the DC jail is, which is where DC General is, 65 square football fields of public land in the city. And what we have to do is to put enormous pressure on the mayor and the council to make sure that they do not give that property away to developers for next to nothing, and that whatever public housing units are destroyed, that developers are forced to replace that housing before they build one damn inch of market rate housing. That is our responsibility, and the Congresswoman, we will ask her to help us on that. But we cannot give that away. Yes,
Thank you, Reverend. Because this land, the district wants to buy that land. And if you get from the get-go and say you're not going to buy that land and gentrify it up, you can make it happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Anise Jenkins. I'm an executive director of Stand Up for Democracy in DC, otherwise known as Free DC. And we fashion our strategy after SNCC. Free DC came out of the SNCC movement, out of Marion Barry, and out of Dr. James Foreman. And there has never been a human rights, civil rights movement without nonviolent direct action. I would like to know, and you might not be able to answer this question, but what role do you think nonviolent direct action should continue in this movement? It was at the very beginning of this movement, and it has disappeared.
Maybe you can help me. Remember, I've seen nonviolent direct action go on in the District of Columbia where residents were arrested.
Arrested.
For what? I think they went to the Senate.
For blocking the street. I forgot the technical term, but it was basically for blocking the street.
People went to jail, not for very long.
Went to court, went to jail. I've been arrested 9 times, not recently, but I've been to court 9 times, and I was found not guilty. That's something you should think about.
Well, I think you've heard Reverend Lamar say this land is likely to come. Now, I don't know if it'll take a sit-in movement, but that's an opportunity to make sure that that land, that RFK land, the largest tract of land left unsettled here, the district is going to buy that land. Now, you can get there before anything happens to make sure that affordable housing gets built on that land. That is not how it is usually done. People see housing going up, they see prices nobody can afford, and then they protest. Way too late. You can get a hold of this one before you even get the land. It is my bill trying to make sure that the district gets to buy the land.
Yes,
You heard it from her. Join now.
Good afternoon. Mama's, you got it? Okay, yeah, sorry. Mama Sandy, good afternoon, Congresswoman Norton. I also belong with Statehood, Free DC. My question is on housing, says here, on housing. Would you be so kind, Congresswoman Norton, to explain on the housing as far as people that want to move back in that has vouchers and trying to get back into either subsidized housing, especially Section 8. I understand that some of these condos are going up. They're talking about at least having $40,000 a year, I believe, to move back in. Would you please explain how they can get in, even though they're private owners, when they're supposed to have so many apartments available for people to move back if they wish to, or they want them back?
Well, just let me say that there are millions of vouchers out there and no place to use them, because you've got to have housing vacancies in housing. So the vouchers, many residents have the vouchers, but without the housing being available, that doesn't do you very much good.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. You've already spoken, so if you don't mind, I'm going to allow the lady who's not spoken to ask questions. Yes, ma'am, in the red shirt.
Hi, my name is Allison. My mother was an early activist for home rule and DC statehood, and I just wanted to say, in light of the 4th of July, that every year since I was a kid, she would read the Declaration of Independence to me, no matter where I was in the world, and I think I've always associated it, as she has, with DC statehood, and I encourage everyone here to read the Declaration of Independence.
And
anyway,
to also read Frederick Douglass's July 5th, What to the Negro is Your 4th of July. Last question, Brother George, and then we're done.
How would the District of Columbia becoming the 51st state impact the University of the District of Columbia?
Thank you for that question.
Good question.
The University of the District of Columbia, you heard me talk about DC Tag, but what is really invaluable to us is UDC. And I'm pleased to say that the district becoming a state will have no effect on UDC. After all, we already support UDC ourselves. Even without statehood, we couldn't do without DC statehood. Most of the people who go to UDC work. The problem for residents is that it is an open admission university, and residents of the District of Columbia are very diversified. And so without the kind of state universities, with an S, that they have in Maryland and Virginia, and understand that Maryland and Virginia each have more than 30. So we are at a disadvantage by having only one. But that makes that one invaluable to us. We just can't do without it. So thanks for asking that question.
I want to thank you all for your presence, but please don't leave yet. You've been very kind. I want to thank the Congresswoman for taking our questions, and you have a moment now to wrap us up. Thank you very much.
You've heard enough from me. Except, first of all, I've been very impressed with the quality of questions. I've been very impressed with how you've responded, with so many of you coming. The one thing I would like you to take away, there was some notion, because of gentrification, that I hope we will not let arise in this town. And that is any kind of polarization between black and white people who live in this town. Don't let the real estate industry win. We may need to work together Now, and maybe I need to have a town meeting of my own. I'm having a town meeting. I'd certainly be willing to do that. I'm having one because of another emergency I just saw. And that was that we've got some people in our town that are being murdered, transgender people. And I thought, you know, that's in part because I think nobody's had a meeting to let transgender people speak for them. What is transgender? Who are you? Why do people attack you? I think many people, particularly people, let's say middle age and beyond, may not have even heard the term. So I'm having a town meeting on transgender. Now, if you promise that we can have a civil discussion, I certainly would be willing to have a town meeting on how black and white residents of the District of Columbia can live together through a period of gentrification. You see my staff. Here's one. Raise your hand, staff.
Again, thank you all very much for your presence. Hope to see you on September 11th when we come back to talk about schools and school choice. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here tonight.